I never thought I would see this, not on my street, not in front of my own home. The flashing lights, the shouting voices, the HOA standing there smiling. And then, the moment that changed everything. 1 second she was standing still, the very next second, those cops didn't know what hit them. And what my wife did next, left the entire neighborhood speechless. You won't believe how it ended. Welcome back, friends, to HOA Max Stories. My name's John. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and for years I've been dealing with the drama, the chaos, and the battles that come with living under an HOA. I share these stories because they're real, they're raw, and they show what happens when neighbors and HOAs go too far. Before we dive into today's wild story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I really enjoy seeing how far our community stretches across the country. And if you're like me, someone who's had enough of HOA nonsense, make sure you subscribe. Think of it like chatting with an old friend on the porch, every story, every week, we're in this together. I still remember standing there on my porch that morning, my hands shaking a little, my heart racing like I had just run a mile. The red and blue lights from the cop cars were flashing across every house on our street, the noise of the sirens still echoing in my ears, and my wife standing right there in the middle of it all. I had just told you in the intro, what she did shocked the whole neighborhood. But let me take you back to how this moment really started. See, living in an HOA isn't always bad. That's the truth. I mean, when we first moved here, the streets were clean, lawns were perfect, neighbors waved when you drove by. But slowly things started to change. The HOA board, they started acting like kings of the block. Every week it was a new letter, a new warning, a new fine. First it was about my lawn being too dry. Then it was about the trash cans not being pulled in fast enough. Then it was about the truck I parked in my own driveway. And when I say they went too far, trust me, they really did. That week, it was about my wife's car. She had an old Jeep, nothing fancy, but they said it was an eyesore. Can you imagine? An HOA telling you that the car you drive to work every day is not up to neighborhood standards. I laughed at first, but then I saw the notice. Not just a warning this time. A demand. They wanted the Jeep gone, or they would take further action. I should have known what that meant. Because 3 days later, I woke up to the sound of engines outside. I looked out the window, and there they were. 2 police cars, parked across my driveway. 4 officers stepping out, and right behind them, the HOA president standing with his arms crossed, like he was the sheriff of the Wild West. I walked out the door, trying to stay calm. What's going on here? I asked. But before I could even finish, one of the cops yelled, "Stay back." And that's when my wife stepped outside. She wasn't scared. Not one bit. She stood tall, her eyes locked on the officers, and for a moment, it felt like time stopped. The neighbors were already coming out, peeking through their blinds, whispering. I swear, the whole street was watching. The officers pointed their guns right at her. And the HOA president? He smirked, like he had been waiting for this moment. I felt my stomach drop. My legs felt heavy, like I couldn't move. My wife looked back at me, just for a second, and then she looked straight at them again. I could see it in her face, that calm but dangerous look she gets when someone tries to push her too far. I'd seen that look once before, years ago, when a stranger tried to start trouble in a parking lot. She didn't back down then, and she sure wasn't going to back down now. One of the officers stepped forward, his gun raised. He grabbed her arm, big mistake. In less than a second, she twisted his wrist, spun his arm down, and snatched the gun straight out of his hand. The other officers froze. My neighbors gasped. One woman screamed. Someone dropped their phone on the pavement. And my wife, she stood there holding that gun steady, her voice low but sharp, saying, "You don't scare me." The HOA president's smirk disappeared. His face turned pale. You could see the fear in his eyes. He thought he had control, but in that moment, it was gone. The street went silent. Not a bird, not a car, not a sound. Just my wife, holding that pistol, staring them down like a Navy SEAL straight out of training. And me? I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The officer she disarmed backed away slowly, his hands raised, his face red. The other 3 cops didn't know what to do. Should they rush her? Should they step back? You could see the confusion in their eyes. They weren't trained for this. Not here. Not in a quiet suburban street. And the neighbors, oh, the neighbors. Half of them were in shock. The other half had their phones out, recording everything, whispering things like, "Oh my God, did you see that?" The HOA president turned and tried to whisper something to another board member standing behind him. But it was too late. The damage was done. Everyone saw what had happened. Everyone saw how she had turned the tables. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about a car. This wasn't about the Jeep. This wasn't even about the rules. This was about power. The HOA wanted to scare us. They wanted to control us. And they thought calling in the police would do it. But instead, my wife showed them something they never expected. I'll be honest with you. I don't think I've ever been more proud, or more terrified in my life. And standing there, watching her face off against 4 armed officers. I knew right then, nothing in this neighborhood would ever be the same again. Now let me ask you something, be honest with me here. If this had happened on your street, and you saw someone stand up like that, face to face with armed cops, refusing to back down, would you cheer for them? Or would you be too scared to even watch? Tell me down in the comments, because I really want to know. The silence after she snatched that gun felt heavier than thunder. Every officer froze, every neighbor held their breath, and I swear even the air itself stood still. My wife's arm was steady, her eyes sharper than I'd ever seen. She wasn't shaking, not even a little. She looked like she had trained for this moment her entire life. I wanted to shout, to run to her, to do something, but my feet were nailed to the ground. The HOA president shifted his weight, like he wanted to say something, but the fear on his face kept his mouth shut. The smug grin he had carried all morning was gone. All that was left was a pale, sweating man who suddenly realized this wasn't going the way he planned. The cop she disarmed stepped back slowly, his hands raised high. The gun now in her hand glistened under the sunlight, and I could see the shock written all over his face. He had been trained, yet he had been beaten in one swift move by a woman who refused to be pushed around. "Drop your weapon," one of the other officers shouted. His voice cracked, the tension breaking through his tone. But she didn't move. She stood still, her eyes locked on them. "You first," she said, her voice calm, too calm. The crowd of neighbors gasped again. Someone whispered, "Did she just say that?" and the sound of cell phones recording grew louder. Every camera was pointed at us, at her, at this moment. I realized this wasn't just happening in front of our street anymore. This was going to be all over the internet. And the HOA president knew it too. His lips tightened. He glanced at the neighbors holding up their phones, then at the officers frozen in place. His whole plan, it was slipping right out of his hands. I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head, desperate for a way to take back control. But there was no way. My wife had already taken it. Then, just when I thought the standoff couldn't get worse, more sirens echoed in the distance. "Back up." The sound grew louder and louder, until another police car came screeching around the corner. Then another. Then 2 more. Within seconds, the street was lined with flashing lights, engines humming, radios crackling. Officers poured out, forming a wall. The neighbors backed up further. Mothers pulled their kids inside. Doors slammed shut, but phones stayed recording through windows. Everyone wanted to see how this would end. And me? I stood frozen on the porch, my pulse racing, my mouth dry. My wife turned her head just slightly, enough for me to see her eyes. There was no fear in them. Only fire. The new cops shouted commands. "Put the weapon down. Now." Their voices boomed across the neighborhood. But once again, she didn't move. Her voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "You don't point guns at me in my own home, you hear me? This is my house. This is my family. And I will not bow down to your HOA's games." The officers hesitated. It was like they weren't sure who was in charge anymore. The HOA president tried to step forward, but one of the cops held him back. Even they didn't trust him now. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an hour. Finally, one of the backup officers, older, calmer, stepped forward with his hands raised. His voice was softer. "Ma'am, nobody wants this to end badly. Let's talk about this." But she didn't answer him. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on the officer she had disarmed, the man who had dared to grab her first. He wouldn't even look at her. His head hung low, ashamed, humiliated. And the longer she stood there holding his weapon, the clearer it became, she wasn't just defending herself. She was making a point. She was telling the whole street, the HOA, the cops, that she wasn't afraid. I felt my chest tighten, my hands clench. I wanted to call out to her, to tell her to let go, to come back inside. But I knew it wasn't my choice to make. This was hers. The HOA president finally cracked. His voice broke as he shouted, "Arrest her! What are you waiting for? She's dangerous." But not one officer moved. Because the truth was written across every face on that street, she wasn't the dangerous one. She was the brave one. And in that moment, standing there under the weight of every eye watching her, she smiled. Just a small smile, but one that told me she had already won. The HOA wanted to humiliate us. They wanted to crush us with fear, to show power by dragging the police into their petty war. But now, the whole neighborhood saw the truth. The HOA wasn't strong. They were scared. The backup officers didn't dare advance. The ones with guns in their hands tightened their grip but didn't pull the trigger. Nobody wanted to be the one to make the first mistake. The neighbors whispered louder now. "She's incredible, she just stood her ground. Can you believe this is happening right here? I'm recording everything. And me." I finally found my voice. I shouted across the chaos, my voice louder than I thought possible, "This is harassment. You came here over a car? Over a car? Look at yourselves. Look what this HOA is doing to our street." Some neighbors nodded. Some even clapped quietly. The HOA president's face turned beet red. His little army of board members behind him shuffled uncomfortably. They weren't smiling anymore. And my wife, still holding that pistol, turned slightly toward me and then back to the officers. Her voice rang out clear. "Go tell your boss, tell your HOA. I won't be bullied. Not today. Not ever." The street erupted in whispers. Some people were cheering now, quietly, nervously, but they were cheering. The HOA president tried to shout over them, tried to bark orders, but nobody was listening to him anymore. For the first time since we had moved here, the neighborhood saw what the HOA really was, a bully with a clipboard. And my wife, she had just stood up to them in a way no one else ever dared. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't fear anymore. It was respect. And as I stood there watching her face off against half the police department, I couldn't help but wonder. If you were standing on that street with us, with everyone watching, phones recording, cops frozen, HOA fuming, would you cheer for her bravery? Or would you stay quiet and pretend you didn't see it? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I really want to know. The air felt heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. Every flashing light, every whisper from the neighbors, every bead of sweat rolling down the officers' faces, it all added to the tension that wrapped around our street like a storm. My wife still stood tall, holding that pistol, her stance strong and steady, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before. The neighbors weren't just watching anymore. They were taking sides. A man down the street shouted, "She's right. We're tired of this HOA nonsense." And another voice chimed in, "Leave her alone. This is her house. It started like a ripple, small, uncertain, but then more voices followed. Murmurs turned into shouts, and shouts into chants. The HOA president spun around, his face red, yelling at people to shut up, to stay inside, to respect the board. But nobody listened. Not anymore. My wife had started something bigger than even she realized. One of the backup officers raised his radio, speaking fast, maybe calling for someone higher up, but his eyes never left her. The cops didn't want this fight. They weren't sure how to handle it. She had stripped them of their power the second she took that gun. And then, something unexpected happened. The officer she disarmed, the one standing there humiliated, slowly lowered his hands. His lips trembled as he whispered, "She's not wrong." His words were barely audible, but I caught them. And when I looked closer, I saw it, shame. He knew this wasn't what they signed up for. This wasn't justice. This was the HOA using them as a weapon. The HOA president's eyes bulged. "Don't you dare side with her," he screamed. "She's breaking the law. Arrest her." But the crowd of neighbors grew louder. "Leave her alone. She's protecting her family. We stand with her." The noise drowned his voice, and for the first time, he looked small. Powerless. His little empire of rules and fines was cracking, and he knew it. My wife's eyes flicked toward me, just for a second. It was like she was telling me, this isn't just about us anymore. It's about all of them. The backup officer, the older one who had tried to reason, stepped closer again. His voice was firm but calm. "Ma'am, I understand you're angry, but this could get dangerous real fast. Please, lower the weapon." She tilted her head slightly. "Dangerous? You call this dangerous? What's dangerous is an HOA that thinks it can send armed men to threaten families over a car, over grass, over rules that make no sense. That's dangerous." The crowd erupted again. Some clapped, others cheered, others shouted yes, at the top of their lungs. The HOA president's face twisted into rage. He shouted something I'll never forget, "You people are nothing without this board. Without us, your homes are worthless." And that was the final straw. Neighbors who had been silent for years finally broke. One man yelled, "My father built this house with his own hands." A woman screamed, "You can't control us forever." Another said, "We pay you. You work for us." The president looked around, realizing he had lost his army. His power wasn't in his clipboard anymore. It wasn't in his fines. It wasn't in the bylaws. It had always been in fear. And my wife had just ripped that fear right out of everyone's hearts. I watched her lower the gun slightly, not drop it, not surrender, but ease it down just enough to show she was in control. She didn't need to hold it high anymore. She had already won. But the cops, they weren't ready to let it go. One of the younger officers, his face red with frustration, stepped forward. "Enough. She's under arrest." He reached for his cuffs, his eyes darting nervously at the crowd. And in that second, my wife made her move. She twisted her wrist, spun the pistol around, and handed it back to the disarmed officer. The same one who had already looked ashamed. She pressed it into his chest and whispered, "You know this isn't right." The crowd gasped. The officer froze, staring at the gun in his hands, his jaw clenched. He looked at her, then at the HOA president, then back at her. And slowly, very slowly, he holstered it. The neighborhood cheered. The sound was deafening. For the first time, I felt like we weren't alone anymore. The president shouted in anger, screaming at the cops, "Do your job. Arrest her. Arrest him too." He pointed at me, his finger trembling. But none of them moved. Not one. The officer who took back his weapon turned toward him, his voice cold. "We're not here to be your muscle." The president's mouth fell open. He sputtered, shaking his head, trying to bark orders, but his own voice betrayed him. It cracked, it wavered. And that's when my wife spoke again, her voice calm, steady, but louder this time. "This HOA is done bullying us. done bullying anyone. You can't scare us anymore." Every neighbor cheered again. Phones were recording, cameras flashing, people shouting support. It wasn't just our fight anymore, it was everyone's. The president, red-faced and furious, stomped his foot like a child denied candy. He shouted at the board members behind him, "Say something. Back me up." But they stayed quiet. Some even stepped back, away from him. The man who had ruled over this neighborhood for years, who had written fine after fine, who had threatened family after family, suddenly stood all alone. The irony was almost poetic. I stood frozen, still in disbelief. My wife, calm and fearless, stood like a warrior. The cops, now conflicted, backed off slowly, unsure what to do next. And the neighbors, they finally saw the truth. We weren't the enemy. The HOA was. And I can tell you this, on that day, I realized something. Sometimes it only takes one person, one act of courage, to break years of silence and fear. But let me ask you something, if your HOA pushed you this far, if they humiliated you, threatened you, and brought cops to your door, would you fight back like she did? Or would you stay quiet just to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, I really want to hear your thoughts. The crowd's voices still echoed in my ears, their cheers, their anger, their defiance. It felt like the whole neighborhood had woken up after years of sleep. And all because one woman, my wife, refused to be pushed down. But as the noise grew louder, so did the danger. The HOA president wasn't finished. His pride was wounded, his control slipping. He wasn't about to lose everything in one afternoon. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, dialing frantically. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught pieces: board meeting, emergency, we'll handle her. He wasn't giving up, he was planning something. The police stood awkwardly now, some glancing at each other, unsure whether to leave or stay. Their authority had been shattered in front of everyone. The officer who took back his gun from my wife still hadn't said a word, his silence louder than any order. And me? My heart was still pounding in my chest. I wanted to grab my wife, pull her inside, lock the door. But she wasn't ready to move. She stood tall, her eyes never leaving the HOA president. He finally snapped. "This isn't over," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You think you can humiliate me? You think you can defy the board? You'll regret this." The crowd booed him. Someone shouted, "We regret voting for you." Another yelled, "Step down already." For the first time in years, the people who feared him were shouting back. His face twisted, red as fire, his eyes darting in every direction. He was losing control, not just of us, but of the entire neighborhood. And then, he did something none of us expected. He stormed across the street, right up to my property line, his finger stabbing the air. "This house is in violation," he yelled. "This woman is in violation. And I swear, by the bylaws of this association, you will pay every fine until you beg to leave." He was desperate now. Screaming bylaws like they were weapons, waving his clipboard like it was a sword. But the crowd laughed. Some shook their heads. The fear was gone, replaced with something stronger: anger, unity. My wife stepped forward, her voice cutting through his tantrum. "You don't own us. You don't own this street. And we are done listening to your threats." Her words struck him like a slap. His body stiffened, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might actually lunge at her. But then he saw the phones. Dozens of cameras pointed straight at him. He froze, trapped by his own arrogance. The cops, realizing the standoff wasn't ending, finally began pulling back. One by one, they returned to their cars, lights still flashing, radios buzzing. None dared arrest her. None dared touch her again. But the HOA president, he wasn't leaving. As the last squad car rolled away, he stood in the middle of the street, shouting, "Fine. Fine. You want to play this game? You'll see what happens when the board meets tonight. This neighborhood will fall apart without me." The neighbors groaned. Some shouted back. One older man called out, "Maybe that's what we want." The cheers that followed were louder than any siren. And right there, in that chaotic moment, a shift happened. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. They weren't whispering behind curtains. They weren't hiding in silence. They were standing in the open, side by side, against the very people who claimed to protect them. I looked at my wife, her shoulders still squared, her chin high, her eyes sharp. She didn't need to say it. I could see it written all over her face. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was about everyone. And that scared me more than anything. Because when one battle ends, another one begins. The HOA president stormed off, his face red, his fists clenched, his phone already pressed to his ear. He disappeared into his house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The crowd slowly began to thin. Neighbors walked back to their homes, still buzzing, still whispering. Some stayed behind, walking up to me, patting me on the shoulder, shaking my wife's hand, thanking her. One woman, tears in her eyes, whispered, "You don't know what this means to us. We've been scared for years. Tonight, you gave us courage." Her words hit me hard. Courage. My wife had given them courage. And once people taste that, it can't be taken back. As the sun dipped lower, the street finally quieted. But I knew silence didn't mean peace. It meant the storm was gathering. We went back inside, closed the door, and for the first time all day, I could finally breathe. I sat down, my legs weak, my mind racing. My wife walked past me, calm as ever, and poured herself a glass of water. She drank slowly, like nothing had happened. I stared at her, shaking my head. "Do you even realize what you just did?" I whispered. She looked at me with that same calm fire in her eyes. "Yes," she said. I showed them we're not afraid. And that's when the phone rang. The sound cut through the house like a knife. Loud. Sharp. Relentless. I walked over, my hands trembling, and picked it up. A voice on the other end hissed, low and angry. "You made a mistake today, and tonight, the board will make sure you pay." Click. The line went dead. I stood there frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear, the dial tone buzzing. My wife walked over slowly, took the phone from my hand, and set it down. She smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a shaky one. A smile of someone who had already decided what comes next. "We'll be ready," she said softly. And I believed her. But let me ask you, if your phone rang after a day like this, and a voice threatened you and your family, would you answer again? Or would you ignore every call, wondering what danger waits on the other side? Tell me in the comments, I'd love to hear what you'd do. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of my wife disarming that officer replayed over and over in my mind. The way she stood there, fearless, unshaken, while the whole street watched. It was the kind of moment that never leaves you. But what kept me awake wasn't pride. It was fear. The phone call, that cold voice promising that the board would make us pay. It echoed in my head like a drum. I knew the HOA president wasn't going to let this go. Men like him don't back down. They dig in. They strike back. I sat by the window, watching the street under the dim glow of the streetlights. Shadows stretched long across the pavement. Every car that passed made me tense up. Every sound in the night made my heart beat faster. And then, I saw them. Across the street, in the HOA president's house, the lights were on. Cars were pulling up one by one. Men and women in suits, carrying folders, whispering to each other. They were gathering. The board was meeting. I watched as they filed inside. I couldn't hear their words, but I could imagine them. Plans. Retaliation. Punishment. My wife walked up behind me, resting her hand on my shoulder. "They're planning something," I whispered. She didn't look worried. Not even a little. "Let them plan," she said softly. "We'll be ready." But I wasn't sure. Ready for what? A fine? A lawsuit? More police? Or something worse? Hours passed. I must have dozed off in the chair, because the next thing I remember was the sound of banging at the door. Boom! 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 It was early morning. The sun wasn't even up yet. My heart jumped into my throat. I stumbled to the door, my hands shaking. When I opened it, there they were. 3 board members. Stern faces. Cold eyes. Each holding a thick envelope. The one in front spoke first, his voice sharp. You and your wife are hereby fined for violation of community standards. Effective immediately. He shoved the envelope into my chest. I opened it with trembling fingers. Page after page of nonsense. Fines stacked on fines. Thousands of dollars. Each one more absurd than the last, disturbing the peace, endangering neighbors, failure to comply with HOA rules. It was a financial ambush. They wanted to bury us under paper and ink. I laughed, though it wasn't really a laugh. More like a bitter chuckle. You think this scares us? I said. The man smirked. It's only the beginning. Before I could respond, my wife stepped past me. She took the papers, glanced at them, then tore them in half right in front of their faces. The pieces floated to the ground like confetti. Her voice was calm, but it cut like a blade. You don't own us. Take your papers and get off my porch. The board members stiffened, their eyes wide. For a second, I thought they might explode. But instead, they turned sharply and walked away, their shoes crunching against the gravel, their heads held high like they hadn't just been humiliated. As they disappeared into the HOA president's house, I knew this wasn't over. The day dragged on, heavy and slow. Neighbors stopped by, some quietly thanking us, others warning us. Be careful, one man whispered. They've ruined people before. They won't stop until they break you. I nodded, but inside, I felt the weight pressing down harder. That evening, as the sun dipped low, the real blow came. A certified letter. Delivered by hand. Stamped and sealed. I opened it at the kitchen table with my wife beside me. It wasn't just fines anymore. It was worse. The letter said the board had voted to place a lien on our home. If we didn't pay, they could take it. My stomach twisted. My chest burned. This was no longer about rules. This was war. I looked at my wife, expecting fear. But she didn't flinch. She set the letter down, folded her arms, and said, "Let them try." That night, word spread fast. Neighbors came by, furious at the board's actions. Some offered to help. Some offered money. Some just wanted to show support. The street was alive with whispers of rebellion. And then, something incredible happened. One by one, neighbors started pulling out their own letters. Their own fines. Their own threats. A woman showed me her stack, almost an inch thick. Another man said the board had threatened to foreclose on him once. An older couple admitted they had been paying ridiculous fees for years, too scared to fight back. The HOA had ruled through fear and silence. But now, people were speaking out. It was like a fire spreading. My wife's act of defiance had sparked something bigger. People were angry. People were ready. And as I looked around at my neighbors standing together in my yard, holding their letters, their warnings, their fear, I realized the HOA had made their biggest mistake. They thought they were punishing us. But they had united us. The board didn't just have a problem with me and my wife anymore. They had a problem with the entire neighborhood. But here's what I keep asking myself, and I want to hear from you too. If your HOA pushed you this far, if they slapped you with endless fines, threatened your home, and tried to bury you with fear, would you fight back with your neighbors? Or would you stand alone, hoping someone else would take the first step? Drop your answer in the comments, because this is where the real fight begins. That night, the neighborhood felt different. The air was thicker, the street quieter, but there was something buzzing under the silence. Whispers. Tension. Unity. People had seen too much to stay silent anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at that letter with the lien notice. My hands gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. They wanted my home. My wife's home. The place we built our life. And for what? A car in the driveway? A lawn that wasn't green enough? No, it wasn't about rules anymore. It was about power. Control. And the HOA president wasn't ready to give it up. My wife paced the living room, her eyes sharp, her steps steady. She wasn't shaken. If anything, she looked more ready than I had ever seen her. She stopped, looked at me, and said, "They think they can scare us. They think we'll give in. But tonight, we show them we're not alone." I frowned. "Tonight?" She nodded. "Do you see them across the street? Lights still on. They're still in there, scheming. Let them scheme. Because we're going to do something they never expected." I didn't understand at first, until I heard the sound outside. Voices. Dozens of them. I stepped to the window and looked out. Neighbors were gathering. Flashlights, papers, even chairs. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't whispering behind closed doors. They were meeting right on the street. Right in front of the HOA president's house. My heart pounded. My wife opened the front door, walked out, and I followed. And what I saw took my breath away. The street was alive. Neighbors of every age, every background, holding their stacks of fines, their warnings, their letters. Some carried signs. Some carried nothing but their voices. But they were all there for one reason: to stand together. The HOA president stormed out of his house, his face twisted in rage. "What is this?" he shouted. "You can't do this. This is illegal." My wife stepped forward, her voice loud and steady. "Illegal? No. This is freedom. This is our street, our homes, our lives. And we're done living in fear." The crowd roared in agreement. The board members peeked out from behind him, their faces pale. They weren't ready for this. They had always ruled by keeping us apart, by making each of us feel alone. But now, we were together. And together, we were stronger. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. An older man lifted a stack of papers. "They fined me for leaving my trash can out one night," he yelled. "One night." A young mother raised her voice. "They told me I couldn't let my kids draw chalk on the sidewalk. They said it ruined the look of the neighborhood." Another man shouted, "They threatened to take my house over a missing shingle on my roof." Voices grew louder, stronger. Stories poured out like water breaking through a dam. Years of fear, of silence, now spilling into the open. The HOA president tried to shout over them, waving his clipboard like a weapon. "Order! Order! You will respect this board." But no one listened. His voice was drowned by the sound of the people he once controlled. My wife raised her hand, and slowly, the crowd quieted. Her voice carried through the night like fire. "This ends now," she said. "No more threats. No more lies. No more fear. We are not your servants. We are your neighbors. And we will not be bullied in our own homes." The president's face turned red, veins bulging in his neck. He pointed at her, shouting, "You're destroying this community." But she didn't flinch. She took a step closer, her voice sharp. "No. We're saving it." The crowd erupted again. Cheers, claps, whistles. The sound filled the street, echoing against the houses. I looked around and realized something I had never felt before: hope. For the first time, people weren't just afraid of the board. They were standing against it. And the board didn't know what to do. The president shouted again, but his words were swallowed by the noise. He tried to push through the crowd, but no one moved aside. He was just another man now, not a ruler. I saw fear in his eyes, real fear. He wasn't the one in charge anymore. The board members slipped back inside, leaving him alone in the street. He looked around, his face pale, his hands trembling. He realized the truth. The neighborhood wasn't his to control anymore. And then, something I'll never forget happened. The officer who had been disarmed earlier in the day stepped out of the shadows. He had stayed behind, watching. He walked up slowly, his eyes on the president. "You've abused these people long enough," he said, his voice steady. "We're not your enforcers. This ends tonight." The president's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stuttered, shook his head, then turned and ran back into his house, slamming the door behind him. The street erupted again, louder than ever. Neighbors hugged, shook hands, raised their voices in victory. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the start of something bigger. My wife stood there in the center of it all, her chin high, her shoulders straight. She didn't look like a victim. She didn't look like someone afraid. She looked like a leader. And for the first time, I realized, the HOA had created its own downfall. By trying to crush her, they had given her a voice. By trying to isolate us, they had united us. The street buzzed late into the night. People stayed outside, talking, planning, dreaming. The HOA's grip was broken, at least for now. And me? I stood beside her, proud, amazed, and still a little scared of what would come next. Because I knew the HOA president wouldn't give up. Men like him never do. But now, he wasn't facing just us. He was facing everyone. So let me ask you, if your whole neighborhood stood together like this, shoulder to shoulder, against a corrupt HOA, would you be the one standing in the front, shouting loud? Or would you hang back in the shadows, waiting to see what happens? Tell me down in the comments, I want to know where you'd stand. The next morning, the street was silent. No voices, no chants, no sirens. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you uneasy, like the calm before a storm. I walked outside, the cool air brushing against my face, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was over. But deep down, I knew better. The HOA president wasn't finished. People like him never are. And I was right. Because just as I bent down to pick up the newspaper, I noticed it. A letter taped to my door. Thick, bold letters across the top, final notice. My stomach dropped. I ripped it off and opened it, my hands trembling. And there it was, the board had voted to accelerate the lien. They were moving to foreclose on my home. Our home. I felt my chest tighten, anger bubbling inside me. They were going for the jugular. If they couldn't scare us, they would try to take everything we had. I stormed back inside, letter in hand, and slammed it on the table. My wife picked it up, read it slowly, and then, she smiled. "Good," she said calmly. I stared at her, confused. "Good? They're threatening to take our house." She looked me straight in the eye, her voice steady. "Because now they've gone too far. Now, everyone will see them for what they really are." And she was right. Within hours, word spread through the neighborhood. Neighbors knocked on our door, one after another, furious, outraged, ready to act. They brought their letters, their fines, their warnings. The pile grew higher and higher on our kitchen table. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about everyone they had ever bullied. That evening, the neighborhood gathered again. This time, it wasn't just whispers in the dark. This was organized. Families stood shoulder to shoulder. Signs were made. Voices were louder. And then, we marched. Down the street. Past the houses. Right up to the HOA president's front lawn. He burst out of his house, red-faced, clipboard in hand, shouting like a madman. "You can't do this. You'll all be fined. You'll all lose your homes." But nobody moved. Nobody backed down. One by one, neighbors stepped forward. The old man with the trash confined. The mother with the chalk drawings. The couple with the roof shingles. They held up their letters, their fines, their threats, and dropped them in a pile at his feet. The stack grew higher and higher, until it looked like a mountain of paper right there on his lawn. Years of fear turned into proof of his abuse. The president's hands shook as he pointed at us. "I'll call the cops. I'll have you all arrested." But then, a voice rose from the back. "Calm. Firm." It was the officer who had been disarmed. He stepped forward, his badge shining in the fading light. "We're not your enforcers anymore," he said. "This ends tonight." The crowd erupted in cheers. The president's face turned pale. For the first time, he looked small. Weak. Defeated. And then, it happened. The board members, one by one, stepped out of his house. But instead of standing with him, they turned to the crowd. Their voices trembled as they spoke. "We never wanted this. He pushed us. We're done." They dropped their clipboards, their binders, their papers, and walked away. The president stood alone, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. He was finished. My wife stepped forward, her voice carrying across the lawn. "This community is ours. Not yours. Not anymore." The cheers shook the street. Neighbors hugged, clapped, shouted. Some cried. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. The president turned and stumbled back into his house, slamming the door behind him. But this time, nobody cared. Because the power he once held was gone. I looked at my wife, standing tall in the glow of porch lights, and I realized something I'll never forget. She hadn't just defended us. She had freed us. That night, as the crowd slowly faded, people came up to thank her, to thank us. Some whispered hero. Others just smiled with tears in their eyes. We went back inside, finally closing the door, finally breathing. I sat down, exhausted, and looked at her. She looked calm, almost peaceful. "You changed everything," I said softly. She shook her head. "No. We did. All of us. Together." And she was right. Because that night, the HOA didn't just lose its power. The people took it back. The street was quiet again, but it was a new kind of quiet. Not fear. Not control. It was peace. And that's the story of how one woman, standing up when it mattered most, brought down an HOA that thought it could control everything. But now I want to ask you. If you were in her shoes, standing face to face with the people who tried to take your home, your freedom, your peace, would you fight back with everything you had? Or would you walk away and let them win? Tell me down in the comments, I'm curious to know what you would do.